National Security Advisor Ajit Doval is in China. These structured talks are coming after 5 years and after the announcement of disengagement along the line of actual control, or the LAC. But can India trust China? What is the actual position of what's happening at the border? I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. Our focus today is on that big geopolitical story, the visit of National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to China. This reopening of talks between India and China, coming after a gap of 5 years, have followed the announcement of disengagement by both countries, a thaw that seemed to take many by surprise. Today, we ask whether India can really trust China. Satellite imagery that is available in the public domain. And there are experts who have pointed out that even as India and China have spoken about finalizing disengagement, China's permanent structures, or seemingly permanent structures, the big question around them at the LAC persists. Will China actually bring these down? China has marginally pulled back this deployment from where it was. But is this to be seen as a normal or a return of normalcy, or a continuing hostile aggression? How should India respond? With caution, of course, but how do we understand what looks like one of the most dramatic geopolitical thaws in recent years? Joining me now to discuss the NSA's visit, but also what's actually going on between India and China, at least the best we can understand and know. First up, Suhasini Haider, who's of course one of the country's foremost strategic affairs journalists and analysts, and also of course a diplomatic editor at The Hindu. Welcome, Suhasini, to the program. Veteran diplomat Ambassador Dilip Sinha is with us. It's always a pleasure. Good to have you back. Also joining us is military veteran General Shukla, who has spent really the last many years being a student of China. His commentary on China is extremely incisive, and it's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. And also joining us is perhaps the most venerated strategic affairs expert in India, Professor Mohan, also a columnist at the Indian Express. Thank you very much, everybody. I'd like to start with you, General Shukla. And if we can pull these graphics up, I think the big question for India and for Indians is, what is the deployment like now? And what we do know, combining our information from officials as well as looking at satellite imagery, what we do know is that there has been the presence of military vehicles, Chinese cranes, heavy machinery, right up until August. And even in October, when the disengagement was in fact announced, or the final conclusion of it was announced, there are still reports that China has continued to push forward with some construction activity as recently as the 23rd of October. How concerned should India be? What does this mean for the dramatic announcement of a thaw in a disengagement? And would you be concerned?
Well, how I look at it, firstly, let's just talk about the LAC. My
Yeah.
understanding of what I've heard and been interacting with people in these last 3 to 4 years, our posture has been strengthened greatly. Uh, on many occasions and in many areas, we have responded with equal grit, and the message has gone across to the PLA. It has gone across to the PLA. And one of this disengagement which took place was not a sudden bout of good neighborliness, but it was extracted on military terms. So that is the good news. Having said that, all these things that have happened, the disengagement, the talks between the Prime Minister and the President, and now SR level talks, I would say that this is a reprieve, but not a fundamental reset. Because see, what is this reality? And I've been speaking on this for quite some time now. The military component of the power differential year on year is $400 billion. Now, that's not going away. So, while there is a lot of strategic commentary on finger 8, finger 9, what is happening here, there, how about a larger debate on the strategic military challenge that is of China? $400 billion. Because it is not really along the LAC, but those $400 billion is converting into other advantages, which should be as worrisome. Strategic deterrence, the higher end of conventional deterrence, offensive air power, AD topology, the whole technology piece. And that is what we must focus on. And the strategic commentary, I'm not saying it is, badly focused, but it is too far focused on the minutiae. that you please leave to the divisional commanders, corps commanders, army commanders. They are competent to sort it out. The other issue that I would like to make is common sense, but may I just reiterate it? See what happens in our
Yeah.
case, that diplomacy must ride on strong deterrence. What is happening in our case, when there is a failure of deterrence, diplomacy comes to rescue you. This cycle should end. And what can happen is, I can outline certain measures. Along the LAC, fail proof deterrence is possible with a certain set of measures. If you achieve that, what you do, you insulate the broader Sino Indian relationship for immediate failures of deterrence along the LAC. And then also
Hmm.
now start seeing what you'll do about the larger threat in all these areas that I spoke of. Because peace will return, of course, with diplomacy, with CBMs, but fundamentally, peace will not come unless the deterrence signatures are strong enough. So that is
And
the
do you
point I would
believe,
like to make.
and you said diplomacy must ride on strong deterrence. So do you believe that strong deterrence is in place?
So I'm saying along the LAC, in the tactical operational realm, whatever has to be done has been done. Infra, of course, is all those things are improving. But $400 billion, the largest strategic military challenge, we are not doing things at the pace and scale that we should do. And that is beyond the military. That everybody has to come together. I'll just give you an example. I was recently
Hmm.
at the Ideas India Dialogue in Bangalore. Now, the finest
Hmm.
economic minds were there. People are talking of $12 trillion, $14 trillion. Wonderful news. Not a word about national security. Is it an afterthought? Should not these national security concerns also be woven into our economic statecraft? Unless you do that, you will keep returning to these issues. And therefore, I'm
Right.
once again making this plea: the strategic commentary must lift from the LAC to these broader issues. The parliament has just debated the constitution. Why not, for a change, 3 days on the strategic military challenge? Because it is actually a very complex and sophisticated challenge. And then
Yeah.
something will
Uh,
happen.
Let me bring in Ambassador Dilip Sinha at this point. Ambassador Sinha, are you optimistic? What do you make of the significance of the NSA trip, the resumption of the structured special representatives dialogue after a gap of 5 years, but continuing concerns about China's intents, China's construction activity, how far back they have actually moved from the positions that led to the face-off, and continuing concerns really about China's ambitions. Some might even use the word neo imperialism.
Well, Barkha, I would entirely agree with what General Shukla has just said. There is a continuing concern about China's intent, China's actions. Uh, this de-escalation, as you called it, China has never called it de-escalation. From whatever little I've read Chinese newspapers, they have always called it an arrangement. And even
Hmm.
India has not ever said that the status quo ante has been restored. We talk about de-escalation, perhaps disengagement, but these are terms that don't really indicate or mean that the Chinese have withdrawn to positions and removed their permanent setups that they had made in areas which they did not have before 2020. Now, as far as Chinese intent is concerned, the intent to absorb Tibet is so strong now that they are now insisting upon using this Chinese name for Tibet, Xizang, in all their communications with countries. They just used it with Nepal. So their policy of absorbing Tibet remains as strong as ever. The villages that they're constructing on the border, that is going on in full swing. And on top of that, what General Shukla mentioned about the issue of the larger Chinese challenge to India, that also needs to be addressed. And our imports from China, and everybody talks about our dependence on China because of our imports from it, is actually going up and has gone up in the last 4 years, ever since the government made the policy of trying to reduce our dependence. So, because of
Hmm.
this lack of the larger debate of the Chinese challenge, our economic dependence upon China is increasing. And while we may be, and I'm sure, we'll be able to tackle the threat on the LSC. I don't see any let up in China's policy or attitude towards either the border situation or the relations with India now.
But then Ambassador Sinha, if you're saying that India has never actually said that the status quo ante has been restored, and that China has never actually used the word de-escalation, then when we use the phrase disengagement. What does that phrase mean? That we are somewhat at a better place than before, but we're not quite where we need to be.
Well, I suppose going by what our government has said and what everybody else, people like you in the media, are saying, I don't have access to in a negotiation points. That the situation has improved considerably. That the eyeball to eyeball confrontation that was there has changed. But I don't have any inside information on this. I just presume the fact that our external affairs minister has made certain statements that the situation has improved. Everybody else is calling
Yeah.
it a rapprochement. And Mr. Doval has gone across to China now, means that the situation must have improved. But I don't think that the larger challenge or the threat of China has reduced.
If the threat of China has not reduced, Professor Raja Mohan, then some might wonder on what basis these special representatives dialogue or talks have been resumed. Obviously, there is some improvement. There is some rapprochement. The troops are not locked in eyeball to eyeball battle, as both General Shukla and Ambassador Sinha said, but both seem to be suggesting that we are not at the place that we were. So, to that extent, the status quo ante of the LSC has not been restored. When you heard the announcement of the final phase of disengagement had been completed, and that was said as of 21st October, but we also have information that as recently as 23rd October, 2 days after that, China was pushing ahead with construction activity in the Depsang area. What does that say to you?
Think
Could we? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
government has said is there are two phases to going back to status quo ante. Now, one is disengagement, which means moving away from very, very close face-off type of positions, to one de-escalation, which means actually moving the forces out of the theater and going back to the peacetime locations. By government's own admission, we only done the first phase. So in a way, I don't think there is a claim that we've gone back to where we were in the spring of 2020. Second, I think that brings me to the second question. I mean, why are we then talking? My sense is the getting to de-escalation, which is on the agenda, according to the minister's statement in the parliament, that since the principal negotiators on the boundary dispute are the so-called special representatives, which is our national security advisor, and then Mr. Wang, who is also the foreign minister on their side. So all that we are doing is the reactivation of the principal mechanism to discuss the boundary, the issues relating to the boundary. So if the two NSAs agree to find a way of actually de-escalating, then I think we would make progress. But knowing the Chinese, nothing happens in a hurry. So I think we are really at the very, very beginning of a process of dealing with the second stage. And then related to that is the larger question. What we don't know at this point, do the talks between the two special representatives, are they limited to the border issues? Are they also going to talk about more broader relationship? Because the Chinese want to go back to business as usual. They want to see constraints on Chinese engagement, on the economic and commercial engagement with India lifted. So that remains to be seen. But I think on its own, I don't think this resumption of these talks, and also expected at the foreign secretary level, on their own, they mark any big breakthrough. I think we're just moving to the second stage of de-escalation, which is going to be much harder to achieve than disengagement, because as you yourself said, removing all the construction and other deployments that has taken place is going to be harder. And finally, I would reinforce what General Raj Shukla was saying. I think the problem is really the growing gap in the comprehensive national power of China and India. China is at $18 trillion today. India is barely at $4. Chinese per capita income is around 12,000. We are barely at $2,800. And the Chinese spend 5 times more than India on defense. And our own defense expenditure has fallen below 2%. And the big reforms, even those that Prime Minister Modi has announced from the Red Fort, have not taken place. So I think our challenges are really, are we ready to undertake comprehensive reforms in our defense sector? Because it's not that you don't need numbers alone. They can be asymmetric strategies to deter China. But I think that requires actually a debate, a significant reform of our defense organization. That's where the real challenges are. These diplomatic related negotiations will continue, but I think where we need to move is really, are we investing enough in our defense? Are we able to create the deterrence needed to stop? Because we have almost 4,000 kilometers of disputed frontier where the Chinese can move at any point, given the military modernization and infrastructure that they've created. So how do you deter that? I think that problem is nowhere near resolution.
Suhasini, would you agree that that there has never been a claim by anybody, neither by the government in India nor by China, that there has been a restoration of the positions of the spring of 2020, and this is a phase-wise thawing. So it is quite literally a thaw. Like a thaw is not a melt, a thaw is a thaw, and to that extent, everything is per plan, everything is per expectation, anticipation, or do you have a different concern?
No, well, certainly there was a lot of confusion in that first week. After the Foreign Secretary announced that there was an agreement, we heard External Affairs Minister Jaishankar speak maybe an hour later at a television function. Maybe he didn't have all the facts, and he said, we expect to go back to 2020. In fact, he said disengagement is complete, and we expect to go back to pre-2020 status quo positions. A couple of days later, obviously, this was explained by the government. They said we're only talking about Depsang and Demchok, where the last agreement was. After that, they explained that the buffer zones will remain. As far as the buffer zones are concerned, as long as they remain, there's no question of going back to status quo 2020. As far as Depsang and Demchok are concerned, we're told that there are patrolling arrangements, and that these patrolling arrangements kind of mirror what they were in 2020, but we have not seen that. So I can't confirm that. General Raj Shukla seems to suggest that some military gains were extracted from the Chinese side. I honestly have not heard that yet. What I've heard is that the patrolling arrangements that have been discussed and agreed to, and in Depsang and Demchok, have to be verified on the ground, and that verification process is going on. Be that as it may, we are today at a point where the National Security Advisor is in Beijing. That's the first such visit, high-level visit, since 2020 happened. This is the first SR talks, the 23rd round, that is happening since 2019. So we do know that, and I think we need to understand that the SRs are not supposed to be discussing disengagement, de-escalation, and all the rest of that. That is being done at a completely different level. The fact that the SRs are meeting is a sign that India is prepared to normalize its ties with China. It's a step towards normalization. I think you have to differentiate between the negotiations that have been continuing for the last 4 years and the SR talks. If the SR talks didn't happen for 5 years and are happening now, it means some kind of step towards normalization is being undertaken by the government. Now, the three questions that I would have over there, Barkha, to begin with, is that we are still at a position where we don't know why China did what it did in April of 2020. This is something that's been repeatedly said by External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, that we are not aware of the reasons for China amassing its troops, for transgressing along our line of actual control. So that's the one. The second is, prior to 2019, Prime Minister Modi met with Chinese President Xi Jinping 18 times. In that space of 2014 to 2019. That's 18 times in 5 years. That's a very, very high concentration of meetings between the two principals. If that is the case, what did they discuss about the boundary? We have no idea about where those boundary talks have gone. And I think now is a good time to give some kind of clarity on where India believes this whole conversation is going. I say this because otherwise we will go back to a situation like 2020 and not be any the wiser. I think the third has to be some clarity from the government on patrolling. What kind of arrangements have been agreed to, and what is the plan with these buffer zones? Are we now going to sort of just live with these buffer zones that have never been agreed to in the past, and that now for the last 4 years have become a sort of way of fixing a problem? I think they are a short-term measure. They are not the final measure, and we need to know from the government how long they expect that this measure will continue. So I would say the fact that the NSA is in Beijing for these talks is already an acknowledgement that the government is looking towards moving towards some of its normal conversations, engagements with the.
And does that surprise you?
Well, it certainly seems to be coming from the fact that there has been a de-escalation announced, that a disengagement at least has been announced. And already the foreign ministers have met, if you remember, after the
Yes.
announcement. And the foreign ministers have agreed to discuss the resumption of trade, investment, direct flights, religious pilgrimages. So all of those came out of the statement when Mr. Jaishankar met Mr. Wang. So I don't think it should be surprising. I'm just saying that we need to really see what today's meeting in Beijing is about. It is about a resumption of the SR level talks. After all, Mr. Wang and Mr. Doval have met in the last 4 years. They met as recently in Moscow. On the sidelines of the NSA meetings for the SCO. But none of those have been called SR level meetings. So now this 23rd round that is being held after 5 years is clearly some kind of a resumption of normal engagement.
Before I go back to General Shukla and Ambassador Sinha, Raja Mohan, would you agree, Professor Raja Mohan, that this is, whatever nomenclature you want to use it signals that India is normalizing or moving towards normalcy with China without necessarily knowing what China's intent was 4 years ago, what China is up to fully even now? Obviously, all of this will constantly be verified on the ground, but they continue to be concerned about China's buildups at the LAC. That's been an old concern in the border dispute. But would you classify this as normalizing ties?
I think here is the problem. I mean, the Chinese want normalization yesterday. The Indians want focus on the boundary issue and settling them. So there is a difference. Meanwhile, the Indian business is pushing for resumption of trade ties in a much bigger way. It's not that the trade has stopped. So I think here is, we got to remember the SR talks, the special representative talks, were announced in 2003 when Atal Bihari Vajpayee went to Beijing as the highest level at which the boundary issue is being negotiated. So the principal objective of the SR talks is to deal with the boundary question. And I think through this, since 2020, in fact, in the early phase of the crisis, both not only the foreign ministers met, but also the NSAs met, saying this needs to find a way to get out of this situation and go back to the previous situation that we've had. And it has taken 4 years of talks at a low. So I think there is a division within the Indian establishment, quite clearly. You have one, the finance ministry, the others are saying we should open up. While the national security ministries are saying, no, we can't do this because at least China is in the middle of a massive export boom. For India to normalize ties now will kill India's industry. There is the question of America-China trade war. We don't know how that is going to play out. So rushing into that kind of relationship would be problematic. And the third thing is really we need to get our own economic manufacturing issues in order before we actually open up. So that's one part. But I think the question is what will actually come out, and I would say let's wait and see. But what can be announced is the so-called confidence-building measures. Right now, if you want to go to Beijing, there is no direct flight. So how do you define, is resumption of direct flights a sensible thing to do, or is it normalization? Is giving more, the Chinese are anyway giving lots of visas, we don't give enough. Allowing more people to travel, is that normalization, or is it really a confidence-building measure? So I think we shouldn't get trapped in the definitions. The border issues have not been resolved. I'm not talking about settlement of the dispute, of the military situation that has arisen. Meanwhile, there are a lot of people in the government who say, look, we can't not have any talks with the Chinese, who are the second largest economy, big neighbor, so we must at least talk to them. There's a view that a lot of retired Chinese, our ambassador to China have said it. So I think that's where it is. So there is a finesse here. There is a bit of fog around this, but I would say the divergence between the two, China wants full normalization, India wants still to focus on the boundary issues. What will come out? We'll wait and see.
General Shukla, let's bring you in at this point. I think there seems to be consensus in this conversation, at least, that there's no restoration of what we understood to be the normal position at the border or the LSE before Galwan, right? But Raja Mohan raises an interesting point that there are certain things that can be called a present continuous phase in a complicated relationship. So flights, visas, that these don't necessarily indicate normalization. They just indicate conversation and engagement. How do you see it?
You have 6 flights a day from Delhi to Beijing. It has nothing to do with what is going to happen along the LAC. I'm saying the two are not connected. And let me say why. See, why did Galwan happen? It is lack of strategic agility and momentum. It was before 2611 that we had decided, after an exercise called Divine Matrix, to rebalance to the north. Then 2611 happened, and then all kinds of lazy thinking, so we didn't rebalance. If we had rebalanced before Galwan would not have happened. Now, why did we not do so? This is the constant story. Acting slowly, not doing what you already thought through. This is what I'm urging that we should change. What has changed along the LAC greatly, and I mean, here I would just like to respond broadly to what Suhasini raised. What had now changed in the last 4 years is that we are in a position, should the Chinese try to do something in the gray zone, in concurrent time frames, we are in a position to create adversarialities for the Chinese also. And that is what the Chinese know. So in that sense, the LAC differential has changed. What has not changed? One of the reasons why Galwan happened, we don't have persistent surveillance. So his revisit times are in minutes, my revisit times are in weeks. To change that persistent surveillance, can we do a few things? There are some startups who can be given orders and it can be done in 7 months. Now, these are the broader reforms, I think, what Mr. Raja Mohan was referring to, which are not happening. So, see, there are two cases. One is to increase the defense spend, look at the larger strategic military challenge. The other is to optimize. We are not optimizing far enough. Russia is a $2 trillion economy. The combined West is $40 trillion. Who's winning the war? So there are a lot of issues. I'll give you just one more example. Say the technology piece. So this ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, they've come out with a 2-decade-old technology indicator. Now, 2003 to 2007, US leads in 60 out of 65 technologies. 2019 to 2023, China is leading in 57 out of 65. Look at the dramatic inversion. Can we attempt something similar? Because unless we don't do that, all these technologies start impinging on the LAC. So this larger strategic military equation, which in my humble view has got nothing to do with the number of flights from Delhi to Beijing. You please do all that. Talk as much as you want. 18 meetings. Why did things happen? Because the Chinese are smart enough to see deficits along the LAC. Now, they will not see it in terms of troops and all that, but they will see AD. They will look at your drone missile force. And if there are weaknesses there, they will get encouraged. So I'm saying that, the solution to the boundary issue, the Chinese will get greatly incentivized to come across or to come about a boundary solution only if they see that the strategic military leverage of the Indians is strong. Otherwise,
okay.
See deficits.
And you're saying, and you're saying it's stronger, but it needs to be much stronger. Basically,
in these other domains, what I call strategic deterrence.
Yes,
all those domains.
Ambassador Sinha, there used to be a time when we used to talk about China and Pakistan in the same sentence. Is that a dehyphenated sort of situation? Because earlier Pakistan was seen as a sort of vassal state of China, and China has routinely blocked India-backed resolutions at the UN against terror groups like the Jamaat-ul-Dawa. What is happening, in your opinion, if this is a rapprochement, a normalization, a second phase of de-escalation, call it what you will. As Raja Mohan says, let's not get trapped in the nomenclature. What is happening to our concerns with Pakistan and the patronage that they have always received, the protection that they have always received from China?
Well, the patronage that Pakistan received in the past from China, I suppose that relationship remains strong, but there have been some very serious concerns that China has faced inside Pakistan over the last 4 or 5 years because of the attacks on Chinese nationals and Chinese presence in the BRI project, especially coming from the Baloch. We have seen the number of attacks that have taken place there. And that has become a matter of big concern for China because Pakistan is not able to provide security to the Chinese living working in Pakistan. And the other is that Pakistan has become a kind of a black hole for Chinese investment. Whatever money China puts into Pakistan, it just vanishes. And then Pakistan turns back again and looks again to China to either to roll over the debts or to give more money. These concerns have made China a little wary of Pakistan. So to that extent, yes, there is a bit of let's say a concern that has come between Pakistan and China in the relationship, which may be a matter of some kind of satisfaction to us. But the fact remains that Pakistan's hostility to India has not gone down, nor has China's. China's approach to India, I think, at the moment, to my mind, I think comes to a great extent because China is facing an economic problem, and China really desperately wants to promote its exports and its investment, which is why it is willing to make some compromises, to show some compromises on the border or the LAC to satisfy our concern that we cannot dehyphenate the two, the LAC, what is happening on the border and what is happening in the economic front. And China is willing to make some concessions there so that India then loosens up on the issue of imports from China and Chinese investment in India.
Suhasini, what to you? You said the big unanswered question is why did China do what it did? And we don't have the answer to that intent. And without knowing the intent, we may never know what they might do next or try to do next. But what for you is the biggest area of concern that you would look out for to observe the most carefully in this round of talks between Mr. Doval and his Chinese counterpart?
Well, I think to start with, we have to have a better understanding of what China has done. We have this single statement, and I say this on your show, I think periodically, Barkha, we have a single statement from Prime Minister Modi dating back to just 4 days after Galwan, where he said no one has entered Indian territory. The Chinese side has used that statement consistently to say, well, the Prime Minister of India has said China did not transgress the line of actual control. We need to understand, firstly, if that understanding from the government changed at all, because that is what the positions on the ground are telling us. That why are we even in talks for this long? Why did we need the disengagement, de-escalation, and all the rest of that? Why did we need buffer zones if, in fact, China had not come inside Indian territory? So I think the first thing to watch out for is an understanding of what actually China did. The second, as I said, we need to get an understanding of why China did this. Was China essentially just fulfilling its 2013 hegemonistic announcement that they would take back every inch of Chinese territory, and this is believed to be part of Tibet, and so that's what they were doing? Was it an attempt by China to stop Indian troops from progressing in their infrastructure construction alongside the LAC? Was that what they were trying to do? In which case, as General Shukla says, do we now have the wherewithal to continue to do whatever we need to do without worrying about a similar kind of thing, particularly in areas like Pangong Tso, where we were trying to increase our infrastructure? I think then the third question is, were there other actions? Because, I mean, if you look at the timeline, Barkha, 2019 September, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping met in Mamallapuram for 2 days. One-on-one, I think they spent 6 to 8 hours together. What was the understanding at the time that deteriorated so quickly that within 4 months of that, we see the Chinese amassing of troops and transgressions along the line of actual control? I just feel that while I understand these are sensitive issues, these are all national security issues and all the rest of that, clearly something happened. General Shukla is saying, I don't mind if you have direct flights, but why were those direct flights not resumed after all the other direct flights were resumed post-COVID? Why were there the restrictions on investment, on exports and imports and all the rest of those, which have not yet been changed? Why are the visas still shrunk if actually nothing happened? So I think what's happening is the government has come through 4 years of obfuscating on exactly what happened at the line of actual control. Now they have the position to say, we have an agreement, but an agreement on what? Exactly. We need to know these answers, because otherwise we lie in danger of continually following this loop. This is not an aspersion of any kind on our diplomats who have been negotiating this, or our military that has been clearly giving the PLA a lot to think about along the LAC. But it is a question of whether what we're trying to do is somehow shield the people from the truth of what has happened at the LAC, because otherwise the questions are going to get much louder if this were to occur again.
Professor Rajamohan, do you want to respond to that there's been some sort of an information vacuum, or a certain confusion or opacity or a lack of information? And of course, a lot of this relates to a military situation, a national security situation, and that sensitivity taken. Nobody actually knows for sure what the disengagement has been, because nobody knows for sure how deep the problem was to begin with.
What's new, Barkha? I mean, when it comes to China, that's been the story of the last 75 years, ever since China came into Tibet. The policy, the way it has been framed, going back to right from the beginning, I mean, wrapped in, a kind of like Churchill said about Russia is, as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. So China policy has always been, the spotted plant that only a few experts understand. And the governments from then have never fully squared up in terms of what is the actual situation on the ground. And then the terminologies that they've used, the diplomats, confuse people. So I think that is part of the legacy. I think the fact that we don't agree on the length of the border. We say, on some days we say 3,800, some days it's 4,000. The Chinese say it's only about 2,000. We don't agree on where the border is. We don't agree on what the LAC is. So I think we are at a place which is very, very messy and difficult. So I would say, look, there are three things here. I think there is politics about the China, what happens with China, between BJP, between the Congress, the Prime Minister. I think there's no point we wading into that. That's always been there. Second is the problem of policy. I think the policy which believed, both in the 1950s as well as in the 1990s, we can construct a peaceful relationship with China. That assumption was broken both in the 1962 war as well as in the last decade. And it is not that Chinese were being nasty to us alone. China has done this in South China Sea, with Philippines, with Vietnam, with everyone, because Chinese military power has grown. And I think this is the point that General Raj Shukla is making. Chinese military power relative to all its neighbors. We're not talking about the US, it's almost equal in the theater. With the neighbors, it has dramatically improved. So I think the Chinese have had historic claims on all these boundaries, and they're saying our time has come. We have the resources to redeem those historic natural claims that Mother China or Fatherland China has had. And I think the source of the problem is the difference between 1990 and now, is the military balance has shifted in China's favor. To Indian Army's credit, you can say, look, you managed a difficult situation. But the problem of the military gap is not going to go away, and how we deal with it. So that's one set of issues. The second set of issues is there is difference in the Indian establishment, as I said, and within the Indian establishment as a whole, which says, look, how do we deal with the economic relationship given the situation where we are in? If India wants to export more, it needs the Chinese inputs. So the strategic community says, you're already gifting China $100 billion a year. Do you want to keep doing it? Do you want to build your own capabilities? These are near-term issues. And I think there is a genuine debate here between those who think we should have better economic relationship with China and others who say, if we do it now, it's going to get worse. And I think this is where the SR talks, which were originally designed for dealing with the boundary dispute, later became shooting breeze about everything from, what's happening in the US, let's also talk about South China Sea, to that kind of a dialogue. So what comes out from this? Is there going to be a shift towards other issues as away from state of border defined state of the relationship to one which says, we'll manage both, we must expand the relationship, even while we begin to deal with the process of de-escalation? I think that's an open-ended question. We'll see. We'll know only when the statement comes out from these talks.
Quickly, Ambassador Sinha, to that divergence within India's own establishment. The fact is that we know that China has been among India's top 2 trading partners now for over a decade, and there is genuine concern among some, depending on your politics, about China's complete control over domestic products in India, and the fact that is also a way for the Chinese to exercise influence. But there is another school of thought that, you heard General Shukla, no connection between what's happening at the border and the flights between Delhi and Beijing. How do you see it?
But there's definitely a lot of pressure from Indian business and people who think that economics should prevail in foreign policy. That China being such a large economy, our neighbor, willing to export to India, and we are willing to, and we are in a position to buy cheap stuff from China, we should continue to do so. After all, the whole policy of importing APIs from China for our pharma industry, the active pharma ingredients, at the expense of our own PSUs, which used to manufacture them, coming to a position where our pharma exports are completely dependent upon imports from China, our automobile exports depending on ancillary parts, our entire electronics industry. So this dependence has been built up over a period of time because of the approach of a number of people in India, especially the business circles, that if there are cheap products available from China, we should import them and simply use them because it's to our economic benefit. But then on the other hand, you have the other issue of the concern on the border, where you have security concerns, and when things happen on the border like Galwan, then we have to start thinking. And it was for the first time that India started saying that we are going to link the two, and there can be no progress in economic relations unless there is progress on the border. So that is a policy. I hope that policy has not changed, but we don't know at the moment what is happening in these talks and how we intend to proceed.
I do have to close, General Shukla, if you have just a 30-seconder to wrap this conversation. Can we unmute General Shukla, please? Sir, hang on, sir. I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
So I'll just make 3-4 points very quickly. One is, this constant applause of the bravery of the Indian Army is good, but valor has its limits. It needs to be funded. That's the first point. Let us shed our strategic innocence about China, not speculate on intent, not get distracted. When this whole build-up in the WTC was taking place, we were told, no, the primary orientation is Taiwan. It didn't prove to be true. The third is, I see the sense of resignation. Ki bhai, China itni badi economy, hum kuch nahi kar sakte. I'm of the firm view we can do a symmetric addressal of China with some smart things. And the last point is, I have a bone to pick with my American friends. And I was very gung-ho on the American relationship, technology coming and all. Now the same bureaucracies are back. See what is happening in the F-14, F-04 engine. And look at this thing. Russia in war has given us INS Tuchel faster, and the Americans are dragging their feet on all those issues. So the Americans also, technology-enabled Indian military is in the American self-interest. If all these things, we can make some progress on all these issues, perhaps our deterrence with China will strengthen and peace may be around the corner or some distance away, but more proximate.
That's a good line there. Valor has its limits. It needs to be funded. One thing we didn't get to talk about in this conversation too much was what happens between the Americans and the Chinese. Trump issuing that sort of off-the-cuff invite to Xi Jinping. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. It's going to have a direct impact on all kinds of other equations, but we leave it there. As they say, famously, watch this space. At least we're watching it as much as we can. At the moment, it needs a bit of an X-ray vision because there's a lot we don't know and a lot we're waiting to see unfold. Professor Raja Mohan, Suhasini, Haider, Ambassador Sinha, General Shukla, thank you. It's been a pleasure. To our audience, thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.